In writing the book that I did, identifying Marxist-rooted critical race theory, and in advising our service members to seek to be apolitical in a hyper-politicized environment, I was fired from my command for political partisanship. And so it was important that I do this 3-part series up front to describe why I was fired. And frankly, I don't know that our senior military leaders understood exactly why they were firing me, other than the climate of fear that we had generated for ourselves in the lead up to when I published my book. We had generated a climate of fear, and we acted out of fear. And I'll talk about what followed the investigation, what followed my firing, which was an investigation from the Air Force Inspector General's office. I'll talk about that in just a moment, because I think our senior military leaders have put themselves in a very tough position when they fired me for writing this book and for speaking about it publicly, because, frankly, I don't believe I had done anything wrong, and I don't think they did either. Never alienate or discriminate against people for those reasons I just read. This includes alienating or discriminating against conservatives, whites, cisgenders, heterosexuals, Jews, Christians, masculine men, feminine women, and any and every other identity group or affiliation that is constantly under rhetorical attack by postmodernists, neo-Marxists, cancel culturists, woke supremacists, and vindictive social justice activists. Never insist, again, this is still directed at our service members, never insist that we live in and serve at the behest of a white supremacist country. If the services facilitate the spread of such lies, they will face retention problems on both sides of the political aisle, on both sides of the political aisle that will be extremely difficult to recover from. Never force equality of outcomes or insist upon fulfilling race and gender-based quotas as a substitution for our long-standing merit-based system. If we do, we will lose our lethality. I thought it was important during this 3rd part in this series to read that to the service members and also to the American people. Right after being fired, I was informed that the following morning, Saturday, I'd be escorted by a fellow lieutenant colonel back to my office to gather up all of my things and to relocate into my new office, which also happened to be segregated from the service members that I had command of. Unbeknownst to me, although I found out later, the service members under my command had been directed not to have any communication with me after I'd relocated to a new office, and so I was essentially segregated from those service members. I was informed that I was under investigation with the Air Force Inspector General's office. That investigation lasted approximately 3 months. I had inquired about that ongoing investigation to determine whether or not I had been politically partisan. I presume I wasn't the only person under investigation, although I had very little information about it. And I had no communication from my chain of command during that 3 months, other than my immediate supervisor, who tried to be supportive of my wife and I. After waiting for roughly 3 months and not having much contact with others on the base or anyone else in my chain of command at the senior levels, I requested an early retirement from then acting Secretary of the Air Force, John Roth. I detailed in a letter to him, which I don't plan to share publicly, what I considered both illegal discrimination that was occurring at my base and essentially tried to recap some of what I have shared with you in the first couple of episodes, as well as some other information that, again, will never be public. And in that letter, I requested an early retirement, and that was denied by then acting Secretary John Roth. And I then voluntarily separated from the service, which separation became effective on the 1st of September, 2021. Because of the months of relative isolation there on the base, my family was grateful to separate at that time. And I don't regret for 1 minute having written the book, spoken publicly about what I wrote in the book, or having done any of the things that I've done in the past year and a half, despite the outcome. I wouldn't trade it for anything, because there's a peace and an assurance that comes when you try and live consistent with your beliefs, when you try and speak the truth as you understand it, when you try and stand for principle and for what is right. I can't say that everyone involved in the process in the past year could say the same for themselves, but I can say that I'm confident that all of the actions I've taken have left me in a position to feel like my conscience is clear. So what have I done since separating on September 1st? Well, during the 3-month waiting period, during which I was under investigation, I had received a flood of invitations from event organizers and others around the country to do both interviews and to speak at events, largely conservative conventions and whatnot. And so I began reaching out to people who had invited me to speak, accepting their invitations to join them for various events around the country, and I've done that for the last 8 months. I travel around the country trying to educate others about what's happening politically and militarily in our country. I share with them about what I've written in my book, and I enjoy being with people. I enjoy their enthusiasm, and it wears me out, and I come home and think about what else I want to do with the rest of my life. Because getting caught up in the political arena is not what I want to do with the rest of my life. Just before beginning the recording for this episode, I had a terrific conversation with Randall Carlson. If you're not sure who Randall Carlson is, that's why I'm going to be interviewing him for the next episode, and hope to do a multi-part series where I interview him and talk about some things that he's working on that I find important. And I think that you're going to be interested in those conversations, so stay tuned. If politics and the military aren't necessarily your cup of tea, although I'm guessing many of the subscribers on this show do in fact care about those issues very much, I think you should stay tuned to hear what Randall has to say about what he's working on. He's got something called the Randall Carlson Project, now the Sanctuary Project, that we're going to talk about, as well as a host of other topics of interest to me. My father-in-law, who's now passed, said on a number of occasions to me in the years past, politics and religion are the most important things we could discuss. And I think that's right. I think it's right from the perspective that citizens ought to be rooted in their religious convictions, and they ought to be engaged in the political sphere in order to keep the civil society working properly. But there are so many other things I've taken an interest in that I can't tell you how relieved I am to be done talking about in this 3-part series what it was that happened during the last year of my military career. I needed to tease out some of these details. I've done that more or less in probably dozens of hours of interviews in the past year. And frankly, I'm tired of talking about it. And I'm glad you've listened to this podcast for this 3-part series so that you could hear me talk about it once more. Anytime this ever comes up on the podcast again, probably what I'm going to do is say, hey, go listen to the first 3 parts or the first 3 episodes of my podcast. And then I can move on and talk about all these other things that I'm so interested in getting to.